So on behalf of the Sarawak Initiative TSI, my name is James Chin, and I would like to welcome all of you to this special webinar with Dr. Greg Poulgrain, a scholar from Australia. Greg was educated at the University of Queensland and James Cook University, where he completed his PhD in 1993. One of the top Indonesian scholars in the USA, Professor George Cahen from Cornell University, once said that Greg's research would change our perspective on history of this region. His PhD was later published as The Genesis of Konfrontasi, Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, 1945 to 1965. And this book, since its publication, has been widely read by Malaysian scholars who are still trying to unravel what happened during the Konfrontasi years. Since then, Greg has been teaching Southeast Asian history and politics, and for the past decade up to 2019, he was with the University of the Sunshine Coast, also in Queensland. But now he is there as an adjunct fellow in law and society, and he also holds a position as adjunct professor of history at the State University of Malang in Indonesia. Several of Greg's books has been translated into Bahasa Indonesia, and his latest book is called JFK versus Allen Dulles, Battleground Indonesia, which was just published a few years ago in 2020. So whenever possible, Greg directly interviews the historical figures involved in the topic he's researching about. So over the years, this has led to some startling results. An example of this was his interview with George Ivan Smith, the top person under the UN Secretary General who was killed in the Congo in 1961. The new evidence discovered by Greg has contributed to the UN General Assembly on the 30th of December 2022, voting to renew the investigation into the assassination of the UN General Secretary General. Greg's evidence pointed to the involvement of Allen Dulles, the director of the CIA, and as many of you know, Dulles was also intimately involved heavily in Indonesia and the start of the Malaysian-Indonesian Konfrontasi. As the talk tonight shows, Sarawak was at the center of this great powers game. Greg has told me before this webinar that he has yet to visit Sarawak, although he has visited Brunei, Kalimantan, Kuala Lumpur, the Philippines, Singapore, and of course Java. And I told him that I'm hoping that he will be able to get to Sarawak sometime later this year when he's in Malang. So before we start some housekeeping matters, we encourage you to submit your questions via the chat box in YouTube as he's given his presentation, and we will try to get Greg to answer as many of the questions as possible after his presentation. Thank you again for attending this webinar, and I now invite Greg to start. Over to you, Greg.
Thank you. So we'll get on to the first of Sarawak and self-determination and the colonial overlay. So while some say British colonial rule in Sarawak lasted between July 1946 and September 63, others might say 1963 was only a colonial change of manager. When Raja Brooke in 1946 handed over the territory to the British government, the purported goal was self-government. This was alluded to, but was never a firm commitment, more a case of placating the masses. The new superpower, USA, was applying pressure on the European colonial powers. It was time the closed colonial shop had a makeover, and there was plenty of US dollars around at the time. Pre-war US federal budget of $9 billion was $166 billion by 1945. There was decolonization in Burma in January 47, then the tumult of India and Pakistan. And next on the agenda was Malaya, Singapore, and the 3 Borneo territories. After World War II, Britain was in dire economic straits, desperately in need of foreign exchange. The Protectorate of Brunei had the highest producing oil wells in the British Commonwealth, with tin and rubber in Malaya. Great Britain needed more time to arrange a suitable process of decolonisation, rather than face an ugly war of independence like the one that erupted in Indonesia in 45, 49. And by suitable process, I mean one in which British former influence was maintained. The colonial war, the Cold War emerging after World War II helped to mollify the demand for decolonisation. That is, US assistance in Indonesia in 48, 49 was of immense help to the Indonesian nationalists once the left wing had been eliminated. But in Malaya and in Singapore, this was not the case. Malayan Emergency, or the Anti-British National Liberation War, 48 to 1960, between British, Malayan Commonwealth troops and communist pro-independence fighters, was a struggle that occurred in a Cold War context. The US was not about to assist this struggle for independence as it had in Indonesia, so the British had time to prepare decolonisation using a format that suited them. As bad as the emergency was, it is a long-term benefit for the British insofar as it provided extra time. At the start of this conflict in Malaya, it should not be forgotten that the head of the Malay Communist Party, Lai Tek, after he had absconded with all the funds, was a British agent. In the Borneo territories too, by suppressing the perceived threat of communism, the Colonial and Foreign Office also gained time. Raja Brooke had favoured the Malays over the Chinese, and there was division among the Chinese population of Sarawak. Some intellectuals, for example, were inspired by the example of the People's Republic of China, while prominent on the other side were those in the merchant class whose priority was profit before political platitudes. Among those who saw political rights as an essential part of daily living was Wen Ming-Xuan, who played an important role in Sarawak during two periods. Firstly, period before confrontation with Malaysia, Konfrontasi, which I will focus, and secondly, the period when he was described as chairman of the North Kalimantan Communist Party, 1971 to 1990, up to when the Cold War ended, or when Chin Peng, or in southern Thailand, ended his long struggle for a people's democracy. The post-war British decision to turn Sarawak into a colony in the era of decolonisation caused unrest immediately, but it was not communist-inspired. December 49, a 19-year-old Malay stabbed and killed Sir Duncan Stewart, second governor of Sarawak, who was in charge of Brunei also. And not only did some of the Malay population object to handing Sarawak over to the British, amongst the Chinese too, some of whom had emigrated there from the goldfields in Australia a century earlier, there was anti-colonial sentiment. The replacement governor was Sir Anthony Abel. One of the conditions of his appointment was that he was not married, as the situation there was still unstable and not yet under colonial control. When Abel arrived in Kuching, he brought with him unaccompanied baggage, the actual gallows to hang the 19-year-old who assassinated his predecessor. While still learning the ropes in the new job, Abel had to make sure the emergency in Malaya did not spread to Sarawak. The monitoring of Chinese students led some to go to neighbouring Kalimantan, West Kalimantan, but Wen Ming-Xuan was still below the horizon and did not attract British attention. An incident occurred in 1952 which highlighted the potential of the communist threat. The response of the British authorities shows how they used the threat to bring things more under control. On the night of 5th of August, shots were fired at a roadblock by members of the Sarawak Indonesia People's Liberation Army, killing a policeman. Earlier, there had been a robbery at the market, hence the roadblock. The criminals had thankfully left a pile of literature at the crime scene so they could be readily identified as communists before fleeing over the border into West Kalimantan. They were never caught. Governor Abel declared they were a subversive communist underground movement because they had dressed in, quote, some sort of uniform and, quote, distributed communist-inspired leaflets. A state of emergency was declared in Sarawak. The end result was hundreds more troops were brought to Sarawak as part of the emergency. New powers were granted to deport without trial persons who were declared communist suspects. This proved to be a key move in 1962, leading up to Konfrontasi. Special British intelligence review was conducted on the link between Sarawak and the adjacent Indonesian province of West Kalimantan, where I said Chinese students had already fled. One of the persons involved in this review was from Security Intelligence Far East, the group that in the early 60s worked together with the CIA in Singapore. SIFE would utilize precisely this link between Sarawak and West Kalimantan as a means of starting Konfrontasi. The CIA commented, saying that communist activities in Sarawak was Chinese schools, 2 Chinese newspapers, the workers in the Miri oil field. There'd been unconfirmed reports, they said, of a force of 500 well-armed Chinese operating in small parties in an area of Indonesian Borneo adjacent to Sarawak. This sounds false to me, fake news for the sake of a good report. Nevertheless, it's precisely why I think it is important, because British intelligence excelled in preparing scenarios, manipulating ahead of time, as I will show when describing the Brunei Rebellion. The crackdown in security in 52 benefited the oil industry. Previously, 1/3 of the workforce, who were Chinese, had gone on strike. Roland Hector Hales was in charge of British oil in Sarawak and Brunei and Borneo. And 1953, he wrote to his boss in London, BMP or British Malayan Petroleum Director, Dr. Nuttall. He was very close with the Colonial Office. You might say they were living out of each other's pockets. British Malayan Petroleum employed 5,000, including 500 European. Some of these had been brought to Sarawak from Indonesia by the Japanese to work the oil industry during the war. These persons were known as Ramusa. Hales was worried that Indonesians might introduce a revolutionary element in the workforce apart from the Chinese, and his anti-Indonesian bias was constantly evident. Before offshore rigs came to Brunei, BMP drilled 2 miles out to sea with a huge iron framework and pipe to pump oil ashore. At this time, Omar Ali Sharifuddin had just succeeded his elder brother in 1950 to become the new Sultan. O.M. Green reported in the West Australian newspaper, 15th of October 1953, that the new Sultan had visited the UK in the summer of 52 and returned with a 5-year plan of improvements: agricultural development, irrigation, schools, roads, telephones, pensions for all over 60, the lepers, disabled, the blind and insane, all for £11.5 million. Green said, "My informant states that the Sultan is a fine, far-sighted man, which could not be said for his brother." Green's informant was wrong about the elder brother, the post-war Sultan, Ahmed Tajuddin. He had wanted to change post-war royalty payments. Sultan Tajuddin had declared his intention to visit London to negotiate the royalty agreement, and if not to his satisfaction, to bring in US oil interests, Rockefeller, Standard Oil. Given the predicament facing the Exchequer in London, Tajuddin must have realised he was playing with fire. He and the ruling circle in Brunei prepared for his succession by nominating his daughter, Princess Eshan, to assume power in the event of any misfortune before he had achieved his aim. She was 16 years of age. Had this occurred, Benazir Bhutto in 1988 may not have been the first woman in modern times to lead the government of an Islamic state. Sultan Tajuddin's assistant in these matters was Gerard McBrien. He was authorised to bring in Standard Oil if Tajuddin should suddenly meet his fate en route to London. The Sultan was supposed to follow the advice of resident Preti in Brunei, but it was clear he was preparing to defy the British. Sultan Tajuddin did not get past Singapore. He had a brain aneurysm on the night of the 3rd of June 1950 at the Raffles Hotel and died the next morning in suspicious circumstances. The British resident put in Omar Ali Sharifuddin to replace Tajuddin and ignored all the preparation done in the event of his sudden death. After a colonial compliant doctor from Brunei declared McBrien insane, British authorities sent him to an asylum in Singapore and then not even on a pension for the insane, to South Africa for 10 years. The new Sultan was given a brand new Austin automobile, and British Oil got access to Brunei oil. There was a distinct political gap between two groups of Chinese in Sarawak, the merchant group, who were more compliant with the British colonial authorities, and the more left-wing intellectual Chinese. When the People's Republic of China emerged in 1949, and despite diplomatic links being established in the first few months, the British were even more reluctant to meet the basic demands of the Sarawak Chinese. Making up 1/3 or more of the population, with a focus on education, with overall political awareness, this was a combination that did not gel with British aspirations to continue in the old colonial fashion. At the forefront of the young Chinese activists was Wen Mingchuan, exactly the sort of person that British intelligence did not want in Sarawak in the 1950s. But before we look more closely at how security intelligence Far East dealt with this, let's look at Singapore, where British intelligence had just the sort of person they wanted, but he did not yet have full power. The British had their man in Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, Prime Minister between 1959 and 1990. In the post-World War II period, when he studied in Cambridge and back in Singapore in the 1950s, giving his anti-colonial tirades, Lee Kuan Yew may not have seemed pro-British, but he was. In the British archives in Kew, London, I saw a handwritten note along the side of a page of an official record stating that Lee Kuan Yew actually received some training with British intelligence. I mentioned this when I was interviewing a British Army intelligence person whose job it was in Singapore to monitor Lee Kuan Yew. So when Lee was addressing a crowd in the 1950s and shouting out, "Down with British imperialism," and saying harsh things like colonial dogs, the job of this British Army intelligence person was secretly to monitor Lee Kuan Yew from a hidden location. He did this with one other person of a lower rank. He told me once he replied to the second man who asked him, "What should we do if Lee says these terrible things about us?" Lee Kuan Yew, he replied, can say whatever he likes. He works for us. At the head of the list of so-called hardcore communists was the other main political figure in Singapore. His main threat, after meeting and talking with him for some time, was his capacity to outshine Lee Kuan Yew. This was Lim Sin Siong. In 1956, there were huge riots in Singapore, which continued for a month. Helicopters dropped tear gas, people killed. Archival records in London show these riots were started deliberately by pro-British personnel in order to remove Lim Sin Siong from his prominent position. This allowed Lee Kuan Yew to rise to the top. And finally, with Coal Store in 1963, LKY's opposition was simply put in jail. One report I saw noted that Lim Sin Siong had several advantages over Lee Kuan Yew. He was 10 years younger and a brilliant public speaker in Mandarin Chinese and several other languages, whereas Lee had to learn Chinese. He was fluent in English and got by in Malay, but did not have Mandarin. He had to learn the language, and he did. Being monolingual in English would have been a setback, Lee wrote in his memoirs. And the British report also noted, they actually wrote this in the report, Lim Sin Siong was much better looking than Lee Kuan Yew, giving him an advantage, I suppose. Nowadays, most of us have forgotten Operation Coal Store, when LKY arrested 175 people, almost the entire opposition in Singapore, as well as unionists and leftist political figures. Some stayed in prison for more than 10 years without being charged with any crime. The last was released in May 1989. 2nd of February 1963, British Special Branch, that's intelligence, mounted Operation Coal Store to safeguard against, quote, to safeguard against any attempt by the communists to mount violence or disorder in the closing stages of the establishment of the Federation of Malaysia. Operation Coal Store wiped out the opposition in Singapore. LKY accused them of, quote, departing from constitutional methods to jeopardize national defense and Singapore's security by joining with groups resorting to violence and bloodshed in the Borneo territories, unquote. Lee Kuan Yew was claiming coal store was linked with Brunei, Sarawak, and Sabah. The main political figure in the 1950s in the Borneo territories was a Brunei man named Azahari. Sheikh Azahari bin Sheikh Mahmud was a Brunei Malay. December 1962, he was wrongly accused of starting a revolt in Brunei. Lee Kuan Yew accused the Singapore opposition of being linked with Azahari. This was the basis of coal store. Because Lee Kuan Yew was closely aligned with British intelligence, he'd have known that the Brunei rebellion was actually the work of British intelligence. Not only did it get them control of Brunei oil, but also it helped to retain control of Singapore. And the Brunei revolt was a step towards, but not the start, of Konfrontasi. There was a lot hanging, if I could use that term, on the Brunei rebellion. At the height of the Cold War, neither Britain nor US was willing to risk self-government for Sarawak, as inevitably would be dominated by Sarawak Chinese, among whom it was believed was a strong support for the People's Republic of China. The British master plan to form Malaysia wanted the Borneo states to participate, but not as one unit, which was the preference of Azahari. Although Azahari had Sarawak's agreement, individually it did not want to join Malaysia. However, when Konfrontasi began, there were skirmishes along the border of Sarawak and Kalimantan. A much publicised British claim that Indonesia wanted to claim North Kalimantan. Sarawak agreed, of course, immediately to the presence of British troops, quote, to repulse an Indonesian invasion. So the Brunei revolt was certainly not an insignificant little uprising. It served the anti-Indonesia interests of both British and US intelligence. And when we say that the Brunei revolt itself sparked Konfrontasi, this is in effect agreeing with the British accusation that Indonesia supported the Brunei revolt. This is not the case, even though this claim has been made many times. This period is remembered as a time when Sukarno was strongly anti-colonial against the British plan for decolonisation in the form of Malaysia. But my point is, what we remember is the 1964-65 image of Sukarno, Ganyang, Malaysia, but in 63, Sukarno stopped or tried to stop Konfrontasi, together with President Kennedy. What I'm saying is this history has been claimed by the victors and rewritten, re-imaged. Sukarno and Kennedy's effort in 1963 have been forgotten, replaced by the aggressive figure of Sukarno in 1965. In reality, this period involved both British and US intelligence. Both were seeking regime change in Indonesia. The difference between them, rivalry is too strong a word, was how to replace Sukarno. The British wanted a civilian to replace Sukarno, contrary to Kennedy's policy, whereas the American intelligence, acting directly against Kennedy, wanted a military regime. Both intelligence groups were involved in the actual start of Konfrontasi, which became a period of economic warfare against Indonesia. By 1965, 70% of the Indonesian economy was being fed into the Indonesian army activities. Inflation skyrocketed. So when Suharto changed things, it initially seemed a welcome relief. British, Australians, certainly most everybody in Malaysia, still blame Sukarno for starting Konfrontasi, and quite a few in Indonesia. So let me give a quotation from the Anzac Memorial in Canberra about Konfrontasi. Their summary is entitled The Indonesian Confrontation 62 to 66. The Tunku and the British wanted North Borneo to join as individual states, not as one unit. The British wanted Brunei separate, and they got it, because they already knew that Brunei had vast oil deposits offshore. Azahari's father and he himself had long been a family friend of the Sultan. Azahari wanted to form Kalimantan Utara, Sarawak, Sabah, Brunei, to join Malaysia as one unit. But British intelligence and British oil did not want one unit. They wanted exactly the opposite to what Azahari was trying to form. So they found a way to discredit Azahari, drove a wedge between him and the Sultan. They blamed him for starting what we call the Brunei Rebellion in December 1962. The Anzac summary reads, Indonesian President Sukarno, I quote, however, not only opposed the idea of a greater Malaysia, but also aimed to incorporate North Borneo into Indonesia, as had recently occurred in the case of the former Dutch colonies in Western New Guinea, end quote. Making Borneo into part of Malaysia was never part of Konfrontasi. It served the purpose of British and American intelligence agencies, or sections within those groups, I should say, to depict Sukarno as the aggressor, when in fact he was not responsible for starting Konfrontasi. The long struggle to reclaim the Dutch territory of Western New Guinea reached a climax in August 62. Soon after John F. Kennedy had become president in 61, Sukarno visited the White House. Kennedy asked the Director of Central Intelligence, Alan Dulles, for a briefing. Dulles advised Kennedy not to follow up any settlement of the New Guinea sovereignty dispute by mounting large-scale US aid for Indonesia. Dulles predicted that Sukarno would soon start another anti-colonial campaign against the British, who were in the process of decolonization in Malaya. In other words, Dulles was blaming Sukarno even before Konfrontasi had begun. Amazing. Was Dulles just guessing that Sukarno would become involved in another anti-colonial confrontation? The Anzac War Memorial in Canberra, again, confrontation, I quote, confrontation was set in motion 8th of December 1962 by an attempted coup d'etat in the tiny pro-British Sultanate of Brunei in North Borneo. The Indonesians backed the coup leader, Sheikh Azahari, and gave military training to his supporters. Although the coup itself was quickly suppressed by British and Gurkha soldiers, armed incursions from the Indonesian side into North Borneo continued, and the Indonesian soldiers began to join Azahari supporters in this struggle. This is not correct. Azahari did not start the Brunei Rebellion. Yet he is blamed the same way that Sukarno is incorrectly blamed for starting Konfrontasi. Roy Henry started the Brunei Rebellion in December 1962. I recounted in my incident in my JFK book when I was interviewing Roy Henry, and he was reading some recently released documents that I'd given him to peruse. We'd be having lunch at the time in the Royal Commonwealth Society in London, 15th of August, 1991, the anniversary of the Japanese Emperor's announcement of the surrender of Japan. It was a grand old building from the 1860s, and very hot day in London, midsummer. All the people were eating lunch were very well dressed, and the men wearing suits and ties, and everybody was talking quietly and politely. The ceiling fans were very old and rotating very slowly. So the room was warm, too warm, so I unloosened my tie and took it off. And the man next to me, the table next to me, he did the same. Then the next one, the next table, they all took off their ties. And Roy Henry looked at me very sternly as though I'd started a revolt. And he said, "You colonials are a bad influence." So that's Roy Henry's approach. I handed Roy Henry some archival documents about his activities in Brunei in 1962. And he was reading these very intently, so intently he forgot to chew his food. A piece of meat was caught in his throat. I was reading something else, and I didn't notice he was choking. It had stopped him from breathing, completely stopped him from breathing. He could not call out, and he didn't bang the table. And I looked up to see him just in time. His face was contorted. It was actually changing color because he was totally unable to breathe. And a waiter rushed past me and gave Roy Henry an almighty slap on the back, a thwack, and a piece of meat flew out of his mouth several meters and landed on the floor. And he gasped a huge breath of air. And many people turned around to look at us and looked at the piece of meat on the floor. An embarrassing moment. It was after this near-death experience that Roy Henry told me how he had started the Brunei Rebellion. He said he had a well-placed contact inside Azahari's group, but he did not tell me the name of this person. Only 2 years ago, I found out that the person he was referring to was Azahari's deputy leader. Ahmad Zaidi in 1962 was the leader of the North Kalimantan National Army, or Nasional Kalimantan Utara, in Sarawak. He pretended to support Azahari's idea of Kalimantan Utara, but was working for Roy Henry. Both Azahari and Zaidi had studied in Bogor during the Japanese occupation, and they'd fought on the Indonesian side in the Indonesian War of Independence. Zaidi was with Indonesian Naval Intelligence. Both Azahari and Zaidi, he was still concealing his identity, fled to Indonesia after the Brunei Rebellion. But later, Zaidi returned from Indonesia in 1975. He was Yang di Pertuan Negeri Sarawak, head of the state of Sarawak. You'd know him well. From the 2nd of April 1985 until his death on the 5th of December 2000. Azahari was never allowed back to Brunei, even though he pleaded to be allowed to return to Brunei shortly before he passed away in Bogor in 2002, living in exile all that time. This inside link with Roy Henry was how British intelligence managed to start the Brunei Rebellion and blame Azahari. It's Roy Henry who should be blamed for starting the Brunei Rebellion, not Azahari. Roy Henry actually told me he'd arranged for Azahari to be blamed. And the political result of this operation caused a split between the Sultan and Azahari. This led not only to British oil interests securing the offshore oil, but also to Lee Kuan Yew achieving political prominence. Lee Kuan Yew falsely accused the opposition, as I said, in Singapore of being linked to the Brunei Rebellion. In April 1962, Azahari was back and forth to Manila to discuss the Philippine claim to Sabah. This was delaying completion of Azahari's Kalimantan Utara concept as part of Malaysia. Without Azahari's knowledge, Zaidi sent 2 persons to Sarawak intending to trap Wen Mingxuan, but it did not work. The 2 persons from Brunei, who described themselves as working underground, were sent to ask Wen to support armed rebellion with his group in Sarawak, the Sarawak Liberation League, SLL, which had links with the sub-political party, SUPP. Yet both Azahari's party, PRB, after recent elections, and the Sarawak Chinese seemed destined for government. So the proposal must have seemed very odd to Wen. Armed rebellion was not Azahari's approach at all, nor did it meet with approval from Wen, who replied diplomatically to the effect that such a step would not be feasible for another 20 years. He must have sensed the trap immediately. The plot failed. So British intelligence tried again 2 weeks after a conference, 22nd of June 1962, and succeeded. 6 persons, half the Central Committee of the SLL, were arrested on residential permit charges. Wen and his wife, another friend and his wife, and 2 other young men, all were arrested. 2 of the 6 had been born in China, but all decided to accompany the 2 back to China and come back soon after, unobtrusively, if they could. But once they'd gone, even temporarily, it left a massive gap in SLL in terms of political experience and strategic decision-making. This proved crucial. Zaidi also attempted to add to the rumour that Indonesia was training Azahari's men in preparation for rebellion. A group entered Kalimantan, but the trick was discovered by an Indonesian general, Suharyo, who ended the plot as soon as he found out what was happening. He told me this in detail. General Suharyo found out, and the Sukarno found out, he blamed Nasution. And this was part of the reason for replacing Nasution with Giani as head of the Indonesian army. But it wasn't Nasution's, the person responsible was Nasution's intelligence man, Colonel, later Brigadier General Magenda, who arranged for training of Azahari's men, training that never actually happened. Magenda was the link between army intelligence and Subandrio's intelligence network, BPI, Badan Pusat Intelligence, Central Intelligence, which was the largest in Indonesia. Subandrio was a key figure. Magenda was a close friend of Subandrio. They both came from Malang. Subandrio was involved in trickery, but it was Sukarno who was accused by the British of arranging secret training for Azahari's men in the Brunei Rebellion. But this was not correct. On British preparation, I should mention as well 2 British patrol officers who found evidence of what was happening, that there was an uprising in the planning stages. These 2 British patrol officers were not part of the British intelligence trick. So when they were told not to worry about the evidence they'd found, they thought their superiors were ignoring plain evidence of what was going to happen. Both of them were sent back to England when they kept harping and going on. The mistake they made was that once back in London, they decided to contact the newspapers in desperation. This was a mistake. Both of them were killed, made to seem as though it was an accident, but it was murder. The stakes were so high that British intelligence were prepared to do away with 2 British patrol officers to keep the plot secret until it was ready to explode. After Wen was deported to China with his wife in mid-1962, a fateful decision was made in his absence. The SLL group, which was generally referred to by the British head of British intelligence in Kuching, Tim Hardy, as the Clandestine Communist Organisation, CCO, accepted weapons offered to them by William Andreas Brown, a member of the CIA based in Singapore. Fluent in Chinese, Brown succeeded in handing over small arms, rifles, which were landed on the southern shore of Sarawak by CIA gunrunner Frank C. Starr. It was even in the newspapers when the boat ran aground, but Starr was quickly deported and the issue hushed up. It was all too important. William Andreas Brown later became US ambassador to Israel. By arresting a token few and threatening imminent arrest of a large number of Azahari's group, Roy Henry provoked a response of armed rebellion on the 8th of December 1962. In Sarawak, in the absence of Wen, the decision maker was now Lim Ho Kui, as he explained to Senguo Kwan, who wrote a master's thesis on this. As soon as he heard news of the Brunei rebellion, he opted to take up arms, that is, CIA arms he'd received from William Andreas Brown. In the same way that British authorities had advanced warning of the Brunei rebellion, so too were they ready for the move in Sarawak. When heavily armed British forces from Singapore arrived in Kuching, the response of the CCO, numbering about 1,000 persons, a few more, was to flee across the border into Kalimantan. The British later claimed this was an accidental landing, as the force was supposedly on its way to the Brunei rebellion, a few hundred miles to the north. They just happened to call in to Sarawak on the way. It was well planned, of course. From Jakarta, it seemed as though the colonial British were attempting to suppress a group in Sarawak that was calling for independence. Without careful analysis of what was actually afoot, without realizing it was a setup, Jakarta, mainly Foreign Minister Subandrio, declared opposition to what the British were doing to form Malaysia. It wasn't the Indonesian communists that they joined later. In other words, they were tricked into supporting Konfrontasi. It seems straightforward, but it was not. Konfrontasi did not just happen. They had been intricate preparation for several years. This is how Alan Dulles knew beforehand and had warned JFK not to follow up settlement of the New Guinea crisis, because there was likely to be another crisis with Sukarno figuring highly. Kennedy, however, was informed by US Ambassador Jones in Jakarta, he's the Jakarta ambassador 58 to 65, that Sukarno did not start Konfrontasi. In conclusion, the fate of the CCO, the group in Sarawak that fled across the border to Indonesia armed with weapons supplied by the CIA, not that they were aware at the time, I should say that when Suharto replaced Sukarno and Konfrontasi fizzled out, Suharto's troops turned on the group from Sarawak, mainly Chinese, and started to kill them. They fled, hoping to make it back to Sarawak, but the British were waiting for them, and they were caught between the British and Suharto's troops. The British call this Operation Hammer. It helped to cover up the start of Konfrontasi, as well as eliminate a troublesome group that had been pressing for independence for Sarawak in 1962. The term Operation Hammer had been used to describe also to describe resettlement of Chinese in Sarawak once Konfrontasi had subsided. But for the CCO, there was only one place where Suharto's troops and the British intended them to be resettled. It would seem that upon the return to Kalimantan, Sarawak, of Wen Min Chuan, it was more a sense of responsibility to his former associates. Fujio Hara wrote that 80% of them were killed. And this is what drove him to do what he did. From 1971 to 1990, he took on the role of chairman of the North Kalimantan Communist Party as if it was his fate. Thank you. And I'll leave it there and perhaps open for questions. Here's a copy of the book that might have some more information. So,
thank you very much, Greg. I think you need to stop sharing your screen.
Right. Thank you.
Right. Thanks very much. So I'll start off by asking a very simple question, which a lot of Sarawakians are interested in. So from your presentation, you appear that the master plan of the British was always that this so-called Federation of Malaysia will consist of Malaya, Singapore, North Borneo or Sabah, and Sarawak minus Brunei. Is that what I'm hearing? That the British really wanted to keep Brunei because of the oil and gas resources?
Yes, they wanted Brunei separate, and they figured out a way of arranging for that to occur.
So what was the positions of the Americans? How would they like the whole setup to be? Were they in agreement with the British that Brunei will be kept separate from this new federation of Malaysia, or the Americans wanted something else?
Well, there was a rough line drawn across there that the Americans, I think they said it was British concern or British area, and they weren't going to interfere. But of course, Indonesia was by far the main concern of the Americans. Indonesia's 4 times bigger than just about any other country in Southeast Asia, you know. That's why the Americans were after Indonesia. Brunei, yeah, it had been British and it stayed British. But the Americans' main concern, when I say the Americans, it was only a small group. When we even say the CIA, you can't really label the entire CIA. It was a group around Dulles that was planning, really, it was to get regime change in Indonesia, and organizing Konfrontasi as economic warfare was preparation for regime change. So it suited the Americans in that respect, and it helped the Americans to assist the British, because the British wanted to sort out their former colonies in Southeast Asia and not to give too much leeway to the strong leftist element that was emerged after World War II.
Right. Now, in terms of the Americans, it's also my understanding from a presentation that they were quite happy to see on Sabah side, on North Borneo side and Sarawak, it will fall under Indonesian hands. They're quite happy for that.
For the Americans to agree with what, Sabah to become Indonesian, you mean?
That's right. Because as you mentioned, once they got rid of Sukarno, once they promoted Suharto and the right-wing elements in Indonesia, they would have supported the Konfrontasi thing to bring Sarawak and North Borneo under the control of the Indonesians, or they wanted something.
No, there was never any. This has been promoted really so strongly. There was never any real territorial claim as part of Konfrontasi. That's really the British promoted that to the nth degree. So that's the main effect of that was that Sarawak thought they would be invaded by Indonesia. So they obviously agreed with the British proposal. But the main Indonesian objection was sort of a moralistic point of view, saying you've got to give the people a chance to determine their own future regarding decolonization, which is, I mean, that was in Sukarno times. And since then, we've had so many instance of the opposite from Indonesia. That is not a chance for the people of West Papua to determine their own future, and East Timor is another example. But that's Suharto period. In the Sukarno period, it was he was promoting his moralistic approach, I suppose. He wasn't actually after territory, and it's been promoted that he was expanding Indonesia in that respect. But when you go through the records, it's more the way that the British procedure of decolonization was being conducted. Cobalt Commission and so on and so on. It was all to provoke Sukarno into greater, or Indonesia into greater conflict. And when 64, 65, when conflict on the border, the skirmishes were starting to fade away and become less important, that's when they started, what was it, Operation Claret, where the British would send SAS troops 25, 30K inside Indonesian territory, cause a problem, rush back, and then when the Indonesians retaliated, it was said in England, the press reports in England would say, "Oh, the Indonesians are attacking again," But actually, it was provocation. In '65, Suharto had already sent feelers up to stop the whole process of confrontation, of conflict on the border, and even Sukarno had done it. But whereas Suharto got the British ear, Sukarno did not. So when Suharto took over in 65, 66, he'd already he'd done his preparation so that when they took over, when Suharto took control, I suppose, in Indonesia and Jakarta, the British were no longer aggressive. They realized that he was basically willing to talk peace regarding Konfrontasi. So he'd done his preparation up in Bangkok, I think. He'd sent a few people up earlier to do all that, to arrange that. But that gets into Indonesian history and it gets more complicated.
Sure, I understand that. The question I'm asking is that what was the viewpoint of the Americans, and especially people like Allen Dulles, during the crucial period of 61 and 62? How did they see the whole region coming into being? Because for the British, it was very clear they wanted the Federation of Malaysia. They planted the idea in Tunku Abdul Rahman's head and everything. But what was the American view of how the region should look like?
They supported that because it was going ahead, and it would only go ahead once the British had eliminated communist influence. So that suited the Americans admirably.
And did the Americans have any influence over people like Lee Kuan Yew and Tunku Abdul Rahman, who were the key players in getting the political leadership in North Borneo and Sarawak to join up or to create the federation?
The only American presence I was aware of, I think mainly British in that respect, but the Americans were present in Singapore in 1958 when the 1958 Outer Islands Rebellion was on, PRRE. Yeah? They had one of their headquarters or bases in Singapore then. But as regarding influence over Lee Kuan Yew, he was working for the British from after World War II, basically, and they would have been on friendly terms. But he wasn't. He was basically for the long-term view was to be British, a British influence, British outcome. But the Americans, if you just take into appreciation how big Indonesia is compared to anything else in Southeast Asia, like it's 5,000 kilometers across. It's approaching 300 million people now, and people don't realize just how big Indonesia is. And it was so important when Suharto basically kicked out Sukarno. There was serious thought in American quarters to forget about the struggle in Southeast Asia. They already had the big prize, and they weren't interested in Vietnam. So, but they did carry on because it helped. It's another matter. I suppose the Cold War at that time was a battle between Beijing and Moscow, and pursuing conflict in Vietnam helped to make that dispute more pronounced.
Right. We have a question from the audience. Can you say something about the U.S. consulate in Kuching?
Yes, well, who was it? Michael Lee, I think, questioned that. It wasn't a consulate when William Andreas Brown provided the weapons in 1962. It was not a consulate. He was going over there to visit. But the consulate started in 64, I think. But he was visiting. He was definitely there in 62. I mean, most of that information came from public servants at the time, as well as archival records. The governor, I remember, the governor and some oil people. That's where I got most of the information that I've put into that report that I just read. But the 64, the consulate, the US consulate in Kuching it was starting, it had, an interest was there from 62, 63, but it didn't actually begin until, I think, 64, wasn't it? That's my memory anyway, 64. And it was an important focal point. Kuching was really where Konfrontasi started, you could almost say. It was the accidental landing of that big British force on the way to Brunei, who happened to go the wrong way and land at Kuching by mistake, and they chased away the Chinese with the weapons. And that's the perception of British persecution of the citizens of Sarawak. That's what got the attention of people like Subandrio. Subandrio is a mysterious character. He was really working, I have to say, parallel with the British. He wasn't in the British pocket the same way that Lee Kuan Yew was. In fact, he veered away from them in 64, and I think the British got a bit angry that he wasn't quite willing to talk with them to the same degree that he was in the 62, 63 period. But he was basically looking after himself. Subandrio was looking out. I tried to interview him 3 times in Jakarta when he was released from prison. He was 30 years in prison. But he knew what I was going to ask, and he wouldn't let me in the door. One of the few refusals that I've had.
Right. There's another question from the chat box. One viewer asked whether Sarawak had the legal capacity to sign, to be a signatory to the Malaysia Agreement 1963 that created the Federation of Malaysia when it was still a colony of the British government.
You mean as an individual state?
Yes, did Sarawak have the legal capacity to sign? Or everything was based on your presentation, it looks like everything was stitched up in Whitehall way before the whole thing came about in Sarawak. Yeah. Everything was stitched up by 1960, 59, 60.
Oh, stitched up by earlier. That's 57. They were planning, they were telling people in Sarawak lies, basically, that they were considering self-determination and everything. But at the same time, they were, with their other hand, or behind their back, whatever you say, they were plotting to deceive Sarawak. And I suppose it got worse as the more oil they found in Brunei, the more urgent it became for them to figure out a way to get Brunei by itself, because it's had one of the richest oil fields in the world, I suppose you could say. And it's remarkable that Brunei, centuries ago, used to control such a large area, and it was pushed back to sort of a thumbnail size state, and just offshore the thumbnail was where the oil was. Remarkable. But Sarawak would have been part of as I said, as a Haris Kalimantan Utara. That would have been possible. I'm not sure how it would have worked out, but that was the original plan, I think, that to participate in Malaysia as 3 in 1. But the British just wouldn't have that. And then once that had broken up, they were left with an individual Sarawak, and individually they wanted independence. So that was sorted out by the threat of Indonesian invasion, and they agreed to basically British troops taking over.
Right. Another comment from the chat box is that wasn't Malaysia, the Federation of Malaysia, originally envisaged as a confederation comprising the Federation of Malaya, Singapore, North Borneo, and Sarawak, rather than a single federation, but a confederation?
a single federation rather than individual states scattered around?
No, rather than a confederation. Under a confederation, right? Every member of the confederation have high levels of autonomy. They just come together to create country, unlike the single federation we have now in the Federation of Malaysia, where the federal government is very strong vis-a-vis the individual states.
Yeah, I think you have to include Singapore in that, and Singapore was always a bee in the British bonnet. I think they couldn't quite figure out what to do. It sort of disrupted the population basis, didn't it? And eventually, well, and got included, then a short time later it withdrew. I think the idea of a central body, Kuala Lumpur as the administrative centre, was always there, in the same way that Indonesia, where it had a federated structure to start with as well, but it straight away became a unitary state, they call it, with Jakarta as the centre. It's made massive problems, as it has, I think, in Malaysia, because it's the distance between KL and Kuching, as I said, is same as London to Berlin, I think. Yeah, it's just so far, and it's been rather an exploitive relationship with natural resources going one way without too much benefit. But yeah, I thought we might get a question about Sultan Tajuddin.
I think the question on the Sultan Tajuddin was that you hinted during your presentation that he was probably bummed off by the British. Do you have any evidence?
I'm sure he was.
Oh, you say he was bummed off by the British.
Oh, I've got no doubt he was. I actually inquired about possible ways that they could have given him an brain aneurysm. And I found out in 1950, wasn't it, when he was there? And I asked a brain surgeon, is it possible, can you put something in your coffee to give a person a brain aneurysm, like as this Sultan Tajuddin suffered in Raffles Hotel? Or actually had visited a few places, but Raffles Hotel he died. Yes, the Nazis invented a drug a few years earlier in World War II, and the name of the drug is quite a long name, so I didn't want to put it on the screen. But yes, you can put a pinch of this in your coffee and you end up with a brain aneurysm. I'm sure he was. His first visit was refused, actually, and then the British said, "No, come on over," and it was arranged for him to go through Singapore. And I'm sure his death and the subsequent way that they treated McBrien and the daughter and the whole procedure of hushing it up, and also when I finished my thesis, when I did my research on this, I was also visited by 3 people from Brunei very soon afterwards, and I'm convinced after that visit they came to Brisbane and invited me. I'm sure they were. Yeah, I've got no doubt at all in my mind that yes, this Sultan was assassinated. So I'm just not sure. I was also told that the Sultan that took over, it's all in all the history books. Hassan, what's his name? Hassan Maya. He was a historian at Brunei for a while. He used to he communicated a little bit, but the Sultan is described, the new Sultan, or the Sultan who succeeded Tajuddin, was described as the younger brother. And a lot of the literature says it's his younger brother. But I wish some people would do some research on that. But of course, I think he could have been a younger brother adopted into the family, or not actually a real family member, but part of the family.
Not a biological brother.
Yes. There's a possibility, but I'll have to leave that for somebody else's research. But I've got no doubt in my mind that Sultan Tajuddin they didn't want to increase the royalties at that stage, basically, and they didn't want Standard Oil taking over their oil in Brunei. That's for sure,
Right.
And he was the biggest threat they'd come across in the time, and they had to get rid of him. Yeah.
Yep. There's another comment in the chat box. The comment says, Ahmad Zaidi, who you mentioned in your presentation, was arrested in Sarawak following the uprising, but he was released because the British wanted him to go to Indonesia to infiltrate the independence movement. What is your comment on that?
Well, I'm not sure. I don't think Azahari went there with him, but they both ended up there together. Yeah, so that's possibly correct. Zaini was the other man in the upper echelon of Azahari's party, PRB. But yeah, I knew Zaini, and he may have been deputy, but the Zaidi was close friend, trusted by Azahari. They'd worked together, they'd fought together, or at least been together. They'd studied together before in Bogor in the veterinary school. But he was, if not the top man, he was the top man in charge of the army that was going to be Azahari's army under the Sultan. And there was some training going on. And that's where those two British patrol officers came across. But they didn't have any weapons. And they'd gone to the trouble of going to the drapery in Brunei and making a few uniforms. But they were training with broomsticks, and going through the procedures. And that's where the two British officers who found them tried to inform their superiors that something's being planned, But the intelligence people were quite aware of what was going on, and they just wanted these two patrol officers to be quiet. But they wouldn't, and they went over to London to the newspapers, and they're very fit. But both done a trip around Sarawak recently in a canoe, and they're very fit people. But one of them died catching a bus in London. I mean, come on. And the other one died. He accidentally drank a bottle of whiskey, I think, in his car, and left the car running in his garage. I mean, I went to the house. I interviewed the wife. Wow. They should not have gone to the newspapers, I say that. But I know killing these two people basically tells you how important the operation was on a larger scale. It was highly important, and they didn't want these two wretched patrol officers interfering and messing it up.
Right. Well, thank you very much for your very, very interesting presentation, Greg. I think the key takeaway was that in the 1960s, after the Second World War, the British were involved in all sorts of maneuvers, manipulated all their colonies. I think the experience of the British colonies in Southeast Asia, in terms of the manipulation of the political elites, leading them in a certain way, so-called path to self-government independence. I think you'll find very similar things happening in Africa and also in the South Pacific. And here I'm referring to countries like Fiji. You find a very similar parallel. And in fact, Roy Henry, after Sarawak, ended up as police chief in Fiji, as you probably know.
Well, he went to Hong Kong first, and
yes,
he got into serious trouble there. I don't want to mention it, but it was serious trouble with.
Yes. So I think I always tell people this joke that the real history of British colonization is actually the history of the British Special Branch. They were the one who actually manufactured the history more than anybody else. So thank you very much, Greg, for your great presentation. And on behalf of the Sarawak Initiative, we'd like to thank you for taking the time to join us this evening. And we hope to see you in Sarawak very soon. Thank you so much.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you.